David Bahnsen, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Thank you for having me. Good to be with you.
So we met at an event in the Northwest Sanity Forum, a very well named event, and I quickly realized we have a lot of stuff in common. A shared admiration for Hayek, free market economics, shared Christian faith, and worry about the future. And you come from the world of finance. And I want to actually just sort of start with something you talked about in a conversation we had. And I want to hear you expand on that for our audience, which is, what exactly broke the world? We were talking about this moment in 2008 and this sort of change that changed everything. How do you understand? Because I think we all feel in different degrees that the world has changed. But you've got a particular view on this, and I'd love to just hear you build it out.
Well, I'll cheat and say at a very high level, what broke the world was Adam and Eve in the garden eating the fruit. But since you don't mean just merely the fall, the more recent events that I think represent a paradigmatic shift in the American economy and in the American culture, the cultural relationship with the economy, was the financial crisis. That at that point, a significant vulnerability that already existed pre-crisis in the way that the right has defended and upheld and promoted a market economy, the vulnerability in that was laid bare at the point of the financial crisis. That vulnerability, in my opinion, was that it relied on a pragmatic defense and lacked a moral defense. That's just a very succinct summary to it. There's a lot that could be unpacked there. But then I think out of that financial crisis, which a really very embedded assumption in the American ethos about markets was called into question, first by the left, Occupy Wall Street, the Bernie Sanders wing. People act as if Bernie Sanders was a brand new force in American politics in the 2010s, and when he ran against Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary, became a front runner for the Democratic nomination in 2020, became one of the most famous U.S. senators. Bernie Sanders had been in the United States Congress for decades.
Yeah.
But he was a fringe character who became mainstream as a result of far left progressivism, and in this case, explicit socialism, that was unthinkable before 2008, but that I believe was a byproduct of rethinking our culture, rethinking our relationship to a market economy post-financial crisis. And I use Bernie as an example because he'd been around a long time before and then became such a major name after. But then really it gave birth to AOC, and more recently gave birth to Mamdani. So there's a more mainstreaming of far left anti-market sentiment. But then after the Occupy Wall Street, Bernie Sanders wing and the left's normal response to these types of things, I think that the right then has gone through what is now over a decade-long process of abandoning a lot of its market principles. And I think all of this has some rootedness to the financial crisis.
All right, I'll keep this quick. If you like what you're hearing and want to hear more, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our new content as it comes out every week. And now, back to the conversation. Yeah, let's dig into some of the details there because it's for me, ideologically, I mean, the financial crisis fundamentally changed the course of my life because I was working in New York City, not in finance, but I still had a kind of front row seat being in the city to that event, to the people, to Zuccotti Park. And then I made these rap videos, one, the first of which was actually had a setting at the Bull in Zuccotti Park. And I remember at the time, so I make these Keynes Hayek rap videos, and I'm coming up with ideas for the next one, and I say to Russ Roberts, my economist partner on them, okay, we got to do Mises versus Marx now. We got to take socialism head on. And at the time, this is like 2011, he's like, oh, nobody really wants socialism. That debate is over. This is all at the margin. And that it was funny because he turned out to be wrong, obviously, on that front. And you're pointing to that, this like complete, like, oh, let's relitigate some of these ideas that had certainly been tried pretty vociferously in the 20th century. But what specifically in the financial crisis and in the moment and in the aftermath and laid the groundwork for that? Why is that important? Like, make the causal argument here.
Well, essentially, if the conclusions that are drawn about what happened are that there was a failure of the American economy, there was a breakdown of the American economy and the financial system, and the victors write the history books. And so who was going to win that argument mattered a lot. You had at the time of it breaking out, a Republican president, a Republican, and I would add a very capable Treasury Secretary, Hank Paulson, who was the former CEO of Goldman Sachs. But what they did is concede. What Alan Greenspan did was concede. He said markets failed. Right. We assumed there was a self-regulatory benefit in markets that did not materialize. President Bush famously, and I would say regretfully, said, to save capitalism, I had to break capitalism or defy capitalism. So I think that there was not a fight against it, and it's very similar to New Deal economics in the 1930s. There was a very small minority that was trying to push back against the underlying narrative that there had been a failure of markets, there had been excesses in the system, that the excesses and the system here being capitalism, and that governmental response was the solution. And then throughout history, until somebody decades later, like an Amity Shlaes, came around to challenge the narrative, it was sort of accepted as status quo that capitalism failed, the government fixed it. And I think out of 2008, Hollywood is far more important in this than a Senate subcommittee. You know, the cultural narrative. You look at movies like The Big Short. You look at the books that were most popular. Some of which were very good, and a lot of which were not entirely wrong. They were just often incomplete. But they were instructive to the American people. The general narrative was Wall Street got greedy and the system ran amok, and then it almost tanked the whole economy until the government came in to fix it. And there's a lot of inaccuracy in that. But right now, when I describe 2008 as this paradigmatic shift, I am not saying this prescriptively, like this was right or this was because of these, correct assumptions or conclusions. I'm just describing it. I think that historically that is the way it played out, and that whether you were on the right or left, the general narrative was that markets had failed, and therefore what we've always assumed about markets, that they are this extremely efficient allocator of resources, an efficient arbiter of risk and reward. That assumption, which was largely baked into Randian premises, I think, over the last 30, 40, 50 years, were not challenged because of very successful real GDP growth post-war. From World War II to the financial crisis, there were a few recessions. They weren't very severe. There was a stagflationary period in the 1970s, but for the most part, the general trend was so positive that you had Democrats like Bill Clinton saying the era of big government is over. And you had this sort of acceptance from really both sides of the aisle that the Ronald Reagan presidency of a laissez-faire kind of tendency was a huge success. That was all there, and it went away in 2008.
One of the examples of that you see today, if you're interested in this stuff at all and you're paying attention and you're on YouTube watching commentators, is a show, Breaking Points, which is sort of like populist left and populist right. And Saagar and Crystal, they basically have equal amounts of disdain for what they call neoliberalism.
Yeah.
What is neoliberalism from your perspective? What are they hating on exactly?
Well, do I have to steel man their argument, or can I? I find most people that use the term neoliberalism are very similar to people who use the term neoconservatism, which is it's an excuse to not have to define your terms. It's a pejorative that lacks specificity. And I think that most people that use the term neocon, and nowadays people using either post-liberal or neoliberal, are doing it in a pejorative way. And essentially, it's a way of expressing a lack of contentment for how much of things have gone in a liberal society. But it is a gateway drug to inviting central planning.
Yeah. So, what do you think from a steelman perspective are they describing? Is it simply free trade? And like I know free trade's a big one. Free trade gets beaten up in all quarters, and frankly, it always has, because it's very hard to get your head around experientially the idea that we can all ultimately be better off, even if in the short run some of us end up worse off because of the change that comes from competing with people overseas, especially if they're a lot poorer and are willing to work for a lot less. But and we can talk about that, but is that the centerpiece, do you think, of the discontent, or is it broader?
I think it's broader. Part of it has to do with whether or not we're limiting the scope to criticisms of a liberal economy versus a liberal political economy. And I think that when you invite the broader discontent that many have about a post-war consensus, then they become critical not merely of free trade, but of immigration, of various global alliances, the Iraq war and other unpopular foreign policy endeavors are used to sort of throw out the entire post-war attempt that is not only dealing with certain economic assumptions around trade, around deregulation, et cetera, but also just a larger political order. I think that, yeah, the steel manning is pretty easy. I think that they would say that there's a lot that has not gone well. That part isn't what guys like me would push back against. I would simply argue that what has not gone well is not a byproduct of too much freedom, but a byproduct of wrong-headed intervention in our freedom. And if you narrow it to the economic category, like the issue of trade, I actually am not sure that I would say that free trade is intuitively something to wrap our arms around. I think it's intuitively easy, and then a lot of gymnastics has to get done to make it hard. But the way that you had worded it before, I think it goes to that creative destruction category, which is definitely harder. So in other words, free trade, where just people exchanging with one another and both their lives are better, zero-sum assumptions are not default. I mean, we all intuitively know that Starbucks wants our $5 more than they want the coffee, and we want the coffee more than we want the $5, and both of us are happy to do that trade. And nobody really pushes back on that. And there isn't necessarily a reason why that exact same very basic kind of playground logic should change when you say that the counterparties live in two different countries. The issue, though, is when it gets into creative destruction that comes from job transformation. And there is a growing belief that a lot of post-war trends created certain winners and created certain losers. And that has become the source of a lot of discontent in our present political moment. And then that is sort of branched into the economic moment.
The coming back to the financial crisis, which it's interesting to think about at this point in 2008 is fading into the past. You know, it's like it's over a decade ago. You did have coming out of that sort of two sides of like the former fringe rise, but not equally. So on one side, you talked about Bernie Sanders and the sort of democratic, socialist, more fundamentally critical, sort of left populist voices who achieved a lot more height in that side, in the Democratic Party. You also had the Tea Party and Ron Paul, who's the one that kind of brought me into this world of stuff, that were making, I thought, you know, for a lot of people, including a lot of young people, a compelling argument that, no, this was all government failure. This was all the Fed printing money and encouraging bad behavior. This was Fannie and Freddie encouraging bad behavior and being essentially government corrupt enterprises. And that, yeah, Wall Street got frothy, Wall Street went crazy, but Wall Street wouldn't have gone as crazy and would have had to pay its own bills absent government incentive to be crazy, and then government bailouts to not pay the price. And so it was all a government failure story. I stick by that. I think that's broadly true. Why do you think that, because it wasn't like that story wasn't getting told. Why do you think that still fundamentally didn't find as much like purchasing power in like the culture? Is it just because all the institutions are left of center and sort of Woodrow Wilson technocrat types?
Well, I gotta be honest, I pretty much disagree with that narrative. It's because of what I said earlier, that I believe it is incomplete. And so there is definitely people who don't believe it because they don't want to believe it, because it goes against a Woodrow Wilson worldview. It goes against a technocratic bias. But I don't believe it because I think it is inaccurate. But when I say inaccurate, I mean incomplete. There are government failures and there were Wall Street failures. But what I don't think the Ron Paul narrative can possibly contend with and doesn't want to contend with is the very inconvenient truth that Main Street fundamentally failed morally. That there was absolutely no financial crisis without people who could pay for their house payment choosing not to pay for their house payment. And when you talk about monetary policy, the buildup of money supply, the manipulation of interest rates, it's difficult to say that certain interventionist monetary policy caused something in 2008 that it didn't cause for decades and decades and decades before. Fannie Freddie is a much better catalyst than the monetary theories of 2008. And certainly any governmental attempt, Republican or Democrat, Community Reinvestment Act or Fannie Freddie, all sorts of regulatory apparatus around trying to force certain behaviors, the overall cult of housing. Ron Paul and his ilk are 100% right that there's government fingerprints there. But I don't believe it was just government fingerprints. I think that Main Street adopted a keep up with the Joneses worldview that then led to all of these things coming to a head, and that there was bad behavior on Wall Street, bad behavior on K Street or governmental, and then bad behavior on Main Street. But what I basically saw post-crisis was the left say it was all private sector Wall Street. The right say it was all governmental regulation or Fed, problems, and that neither side wanted to look to Main Street or look to a person in the mirror. And that was very disappointing for me as a man of faith, but also a man on the right, that I thought we could do a better job with a more broadly Tocquevillian and Burkean diagnosis. And I think that the politicization of the crisis kept us from doing that.
You work in wealth management and finance. You have your own firm. What were you doing? Where were you in the crisis time? Where were you in your career? What were you seeing, on your Bloomberg terminals, perhaps?
Yeah. Yeah, you're gonna force some PTSD here. These were not good times, but I was a managing director at Morgan Stanley at the time, and it was right in the epicenter of the crisis. Of course, I was in the wealth management firm, and where their balance sheet holes were created were obviously in the institutional security side of the business.
What does that mean, institutional securities?
Well, they were the prop desk, meaning the proprietary trading. People that were making decisions with firm capital. So whether
this is the bank's money and
Right.
people investing it to earn the bank returns.
So they're making decisions with the bank's balance sheet. They're levering it to the hilt, buying these mortgage securities. This is where you got these terms like CLOs and CDOs, collateralized loan obligation, debt obligation. They had levered up mortgage-backed securities. And this is what took down Bear Stearns. It's what took down Lehman Brothers. But all of the Wall Street firms had this risk on their balance sheet. Some just had less than others. Some had better assets than others. But everyone was in either a solvency crisis like Lehman and Bear or a liquidity crisis like Goldman and Morgan.
And what are the differences between those two things for people that aren't familiar with this lingo? Insolvency versus illiquidity. It's an important distinction.
It is. And to try to be simple about it, insolvency is if you have $5 of assets and $10 of debts, then you have a negative $5 worth. But liquidity is you might have $10 of assets and $5 of debt. So you have a $5 positive net worth. So you're not insolvent. But if $6 of your $10 of assets become illiquid, there's no market for them. The fact that you have solvency becomes irrelevant if you're not able to function, if you get caught off from market function.
So on a personal level,
this is the history of our country banking system, and what many people have done a lot of work to solve for 150 years, and is really at the heart of a lot of the big debate between some of our Austrian friends and some of the Keynesian and even some of the monetarists. There's even kind of civil, like intramural debates. But most of American economic crisis is one big story about how to keep liquidity crises from becoming solvency crises.
The It's a Wonderful Life sort of brings this to life in a beautiful way, where everyone in the town comes in asking for their money, and Jimmy Stewart's like, well, I can't give you your money because it's in your house and it's your house and it's in your house, and houses are illiquid. It's hard to sell the house fast, but it has a value. It just, at that particular moment, you couldn't access the cash for it. And that's the illiquidity problem, right?
It's easier for people on Main Street to understand it with the residential real estate and mortgage, It's a Wonderful Life type examples. But the same principles, if you play them out across corporate America, the levered loans, various corporate lending, and counterparties, it gets more complicated, but it's the same principles. And what happened at the point of the financial crisis was a lot of firms had bought insurance on some of their risk from firms that then were becoming insolvent. So firms that thought they had protection didn't. And there was a lack of transparency around a lot of this. So it gets into the weeds a bit, but it's what forced me to spend about 4 years deeply studying it. back to your question about kind of my biography through financial crisis, it was totally incomprehensible to me that as a financial system, we were going through what we were going through. That people bought houses they couldn't afford didn't surprise me. That people lent money to them to do so surprised me, and that they did it at scale. But when you found out that essentially almost all of our firms upside down lending were in non-recourse states, that essentially the states could not, that the lenders could not recover other assets or incomes from the bad borrowers. It gave a basically heads I win, tails I don't lose mentality to Main Street. And in California, Arizona, Nevada, Florida, that were epicenter for this type of behavior, that's where you had a financial crisis. And in states that had recourse and had, more severe recovery possibilities, like Texas, you still had prices go down, but you had 6% instead of 40%. I mean, it was a very substantial difference.
Wow, I haven't actually ever heard about this distinction before. Somehow
It's
this
the entire
escaped me.
story of the financial crisis.
Okay, I want to spend some time on this because this is a chance for me to learn something new about this thing I feel like I've read a lot about.
So my first book was called Crisis of Responsibility, Our Cultural Addiction to Blame and How You Can Cure It. And it started off as me having left Morgan Stanley to start my own firm. And now I had the freedom where I could go write a book to tell this whole story. And I had two different fingers pointing at each other on the cover of the book. And it was largely to be a book where I was trying to tell the story that I was talking to you about maybe 10 minutes ago, where I thought the right was telling a truth story that was incomplete, and the left was telling a truth story that was incomplete. My view of the financial crisis is not that everyone at Countrywide was a great person, or that everyone at AIG or Bear Stearns. I think that there was utter incompetence across many of the actors on Wall Street, but those things did not become systemic. The contagion effect would not have existed apart from some of these multiplier impacts. So I spent years studying it, and I read 75 books on the financial crisis, which I got to tell you, I think is how many were written on the financial crisis
Yeah, that
total.
sounds about right. That sounds about right.
And it was really about 50-50, about half of them saying the government caused it and half saying the private sector caused it. And there were little nuances. Sometimes the governmental blame focused on Fannie Freddie. Sometimes it focused on the Fed, but they're broad categories. And my view was that this sort of moral and cultural component, why is it not only that you had this massive increase of people giving their homes back, but that they go to the bar on Friday night and brag about it? So I looked at the savings and loan crisis in the early 90s, where it just simply didn't happen. There's always foreclosures. There's always cases where people literally cannot make their payment. They've lost job, they've lost assets, they give keys back. It's been a socially shameful event.
Yeah.
Bankruptcies, foreclosures. It was not that way in 2008 in Irvine, California, I assure you. And I was left with no other conclusion I could draw that the moral fabric of society had broken down to this point where people could take on an obligation they couldn't afford, driven by covetousness, greed, keep up with the Joneses, all sorts of moral ills. And then when things went astray, would take no responsibility for it, give it back, and in the course of doing so, would see it all as a feature, not a bug.
So the recourse versus non-recourse and the fact that there's differences between the states makes for a really interesting experiment here. So I want to make sure I understand that. So just to define in real simple terms what a state with recourse versus a state without recourse means.
Well, essentially, if most people go to buy a home, the collateral for their loan is the home. And if the home is inadequate, they quit making their payment and the bank recovers the home, but that value is less than what the loan amount is, then with non-recourse, they can't also go and say, hey, you have, $100,000 in the bank and you still owe us another 60 grand. You got to pay us the 60 grand. They get the home and then they eat the remaining 60 grand. But in other states where they have recourse financing, they may have the house as collateral. It's the primary collateral, but they can also go make a claim against the borrower.
So this would be like a personal guarantee of the borrower.
Right. Yeah. And certain states don't allow that at all. It's barely ever necessary because if you're requiring a 20, 25, or 30% down payment, and houses don't generally drop in value 20, 25, or 30%, there's protective equity. So this is where there's a great debate. And then there's me on an island by myself saying the blame is all of the above. But people are saying, why were there no money down loans? So some could say greed of Wall Street. Others could say governmental failure, that they were pushing this activity because of low interest rates, which I think is kind of an incoherent view. But people like Tom Woods and others that are in the Ron Paul camp kind of really pushed to make the Fed caused all of this type of argument. It isn't my belief. But I certainly agree that they promoted generally distorted behavior and encouraged malinvestment, which is the classic, Austrian approach here, that I'm very sympathetic to.
Well, and I would say one other piece, just to flush that out just for a moment, is, as I understand it, is if you had excessively easy money, it's going to flow into interest rate sensitive areas like assets, like housing, where the changes in interest rates have a big impact on the cost, and so people, mortgage rates can change the demand for housing, and that easy money goes in and starts to inflate the pricing, leading to this belief that, we can have no money down because next year it'll appreciate by 15%, and then we'll have equity because the whole housing market is going up, and we can just sort of assume that. Yeah. And this narrative formed that there's never been a nationwide housing decline. You get these international organizations like the Bank of International Settlements even basically saying, mortgage debt is as good as like U.S. Treasuries because it's just so sound, and we can just have so much faith in the housing market. So that's how I'd round out some of that Ron Paul story from some of the other stuff I've read over the years.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of these different pieces that you're saying that are all accurate, but where there is chains that link them together is a little bit more complicated or nuanced than that. In theory, low interest rates do push the underlying asset higher to a degree, but interest rates don't go below 0%. So a 5 going to 4, going to 3, there's a marginal utility here, and the increase was not presumed to be marginal. And at the same time that this is why I think the Fannie Freddie theories are far much more potent than even the low interest rates. Housing prices have gone up when interest rates are higher, and they did go up more when interest rates were lower. And I do believe that Greenspan poured some kerosene on this in the early 2000s. But he was not still lowering rates in where this got the worst in 04, 05, 06.
Right.
And now what some can say is, well, rates were already low, so even though he wasn't lowering them still. But it then begs the question as to how prices were double-digit appreciating after it had achieved the nirvana of a pretty low base rate in the mortgage market. And that really was a byproduct of loan underwriting, that you just had no additional supply, but far, far greater demand, because people were able to qualify for a loan for a home that would have been meaningfully out of their price range before. And so it pushed a whole lot of new customers and demand, but there wasn't like we were building that much more housing stock. And there's a number of levels of irrationality that entered the fray, and low interest rates were a facilitator, but not, in my mind, a primary cause around it. A lot of the historical data about there not having been a national housing drop before is reasonably true. I don't think it's relevant. Like, why would that matter to what could happen in the future? But the point is that there was malinvestment everywhere you looked that I think was multi-causal.
Yeah.
And any number of things that could have constrained it and historically would have constrained it, like a lender saying, you make 60 grand a year, I'm not giving you a $940,000 loan to buy a $950,000 home. That would have constrained it in the past. And so when you look at why a lender was willing to make that loan and why the secondary market for the mortgages worked the way it did, where Fannie and Freddie fit into this, where the low rates fit in, where the failure of credit agencies, even then, all of these problems you just identified, until the banks start levering these things on their balance sheet, it's still not systemic. You just have a bunch of dumb borrowers and dumb lenders that are going to lose money together. That's not contagious. It became contagious when the banks now were holding this risk on their balance sheets. And so the banks now have not only served as a lender, that was actually a very small part of it, but all of these loans that did exist out there in a non-bank lender market, the Citigroups and Wells Fargos and Merrill Lynch's had taken on so much of these mortgage loans onto their balance sheet. So these are loans, meaning it's a debt to the person who owes the money, but they're assets to the lender. The Wall Street banks were buying these things in mass and were able to lever them up. They were not, if they bought one basket of loans, they might have bought it 10 times and paid for it one time. And so they had borrowed money to effectively buy more of them. That's what the CDOs and CLOs were. That's how this went from being billions and tens of billions of risk, which is a lot of money, but it was not going to tank the US economy, to hundreds of billions, and on a global basis, trillions. So the question is, why would all these smart people buy these things?
Well, this is one of the things about this moment, and I want to start to move us to talking about sort of how to think about Wall Street in general today. But it is one of these parts of the story that's weird, because if the banks and the Wall Street financiers were all a bunch of pure crooks, you would think they would just treat this obviously toxic waste that they've bought like a hot potato and sell it off as fast as they could to the biggest idiot they could find, not keep it on their balance sheet. It's like, so that's weird. Like, it's weird to the story of this was all just Wall Street greed, because they thought, right?
Well, I'm gonna do even one better. Your analogy there is a very, very important one. But some would say, well, they had this waste on their balance sheet, but they also thought they had bought credit default swaps from a counterparty that hedged that risk.
Basically insurance policies, right?
That's right. But then you say, well, these are still pretty smart people. Why would they think that the counterparty was good for the credit default swap? Why were they not requiring more collateral on these CDS trades? But to me, I've really now spent almost 17 years asking people that take the Wall Street or evil geniuses narrative versus there were just a bunch of dummies involved, and I'm very much in the latter camp, not the former, is how many shares of Lehman Brothers stock do you think Dick Fuld ever sold?
Was he the CEO at the time? Yeah, it's a good question. Zero?
Jimmy Kane, the CEO of Bear Stearns, who at one point when Bear was at 150 a share, was a billionaire. He ended up selling his Bear stock for, I think, $36 million. Now, people can say 36 million is a lot of money. No, it isn't. Not when you were a billionaire. He wrote down 97% of it because of greed. These people, they were using their own product. They believed it. And there's very few examples. They're different. People would say, well, Goldman was selling stuff off. Yeah, well, Goldman started to believe that the mortgage market was cooling, and Goldman has better and smarter people than other firms. They couldn't get rid of all of it, but they were buying insurance from largely from AIG, from other companies that were insolvent counterparties in the end. So there was a substantial failure of Wall Street in the competence necessary to do risk management. At my own firm, Morgan Stanley, we had one trader that essentially was going long the AAA, the highest quality mortgages, and short the lowest quality, and thought they had a pair trade. And when those high quality mortgages tanked, it lost $8 billion in one day. So this was one of the most famous mortgage trades in that period. There's no way to study all this and conclude that everyone was an evil genius. There was substantial incompetence, and I believe that many people's narrative of the world requires them to believe that there's always an evil conspiracy going on, because that's more comforting to them. First of all, it feeds into a righteousness narrative. I'm a good person, they're bad people. But secondly, it's better than believing that the folks you think have their hands on the levers of the world are not as smart as you think they are.
I could geek out with you about this period probably for 6 hours. So I'm gonna. What was the name of your book again? Because I think it'd be great for people to check it out.
Crisis of Responsibility.
So I want to summarize what I've heard you say and move on to some of these bigger topics that are, because I think there's a lot of that moment. There's like echoes of that moment now, and I want to talk about the present. There's talk in the administration of wanting to take Fannie and Freddie like public, because it's currently this sort of government conservatorship thing that I don't fully understand, but it's like a ward of the federal government. These things have always been kind of monsters. But okay, so here's how I understand what you've said. Essentially, there's blame to go all around.
Yes.
And everybody's narratives were too simplistic, and nobody wanted to do the thing that would obviously be very unpopular, which is to lay any blame on typical people, normal people, whatever you want to call all these sort of silly words, everyday Americans, all these words people use to try to not sound like they're holding their nose up at others. But basically, people who said, I'm going to buy a house that I am stretching to afford, or maybe I really can't, maybe on like a adjustable rate mortgage that's going to explode in 5 years. So I'm only making interest payments and I'm putting no money down.
And I have to lie about my income.
Yeah, and I have to lie about my income, and I have to do all these things. So like there was a non-trivial amount of people who were literally committing individual fraud, saying untrue things to achieve the thing they want. There was also a lot of people who were like wanting to get on the American dream, and in a world where housing prices were going crazy, felt like I gotta move. I remember my parents being like, why are you renting? You should buy. Look at what's going on out there in 2004. So I bought my first home purchase was an apartment in Hoboken in 2004. Yeah. And I could barely afford it. I could afford it, but barely. And it was like scraping by to make that work. So I can totally empathize with that person. And I can see for both political and like, just for like reasons of people wanting to be liked and not be hated by literally everyone, why nobody was willing to say, hey, everybody, a lot of the fault just is your fault because you shouldn't have done this thing that was obviously a bad idea. And if you're enough of an adult to buy a house, you should be held responsible for buying a house you can't afford. Like you don't get to be an adult on one day and then act like a child the second day.
And I'm not only scolding the people who did it, it's a broad cultural narrative, what I refer to as the cult of housing, because you used the term about the American dream. President Bush used that term over and over. President Clinton before him.
Yes.
The American dream is not to live in a house that you can't afford. The American dream is not to owe the bank all the money. When people say, why rent, you should own, but then you go do a 95% loan, what is the difference?
Right.
None, other than you pay your rent check to a bank instead of a landlord, and now you get to pay property taxes.
So
The American dream, the idea of what people mean by it was living in a home, not trading a house. A house as a trading card was not the American dream. Having equity in a home because you had a job and you lived in a community and you knew your neighbors and you raised your kids there and you celebrated Christmas there and you went to the parks in your neighborhood, that gives ownership. That gives community. That's de Tocqueville. That I get. Does anyone think that's what was happening in 2003, 4, 5, 6 when people were flipping homes every 5 months?
Yeah, you look at the chain, how many people suddenly decided they were going to get into real estate as a business and then got out starting in 2006, 7, 8. It was a social contagion, systemic failure, government failure, Wall Street idiocy. Blaming greed is always weird. It's like people are always greedy, since it's like blaming airplane crashes on gravity to me.
I argue that the greed. I really hope you'll take a look at chapter 4 of my book. That's the one. It's a very long chapter. That's my comprehensive treatment of financial crisis. But I tell a story in it where it's a real conversation between Dick Fuld, who is CEO of Lehman, and some of his people, upon hearing that Steve Schwarzman and some of the muckety-mucks at Blackstone had done a big commercial real estate deal in Europe. And him saying, we can't let them beat us, now we got to go do this. And there's a bunch of zeros and commas when Lehman's and Blackstone start doing this kind of corporate envy thing. But then I tell the story of a real life party I attended on a Halloween in Orange County, California in 2005, and hearing people talk about, I got to go get this house. My wife wants this and this other person has it and I make more money than them. Why are they in a better house? And then they're stretching to go get a house they can't afford. And the point I make was those were the two same conversations.
Right.
But one of them was dealing with billions of dollars and one dealing with millions of dollars. But they come from the same heart, the same level of both irresponsibility, but ultimately covetousness, which is a violation of the 10th commandment.
I think one of the things that is at the centerpiece of our current conversations as we sit here, the ratio between incomes and housing costs have gone up quite substantially, right? From something like 3 to 4x to over 7x.
Yeah.
And this housing is the biggest asset most Americans will have. So it has become this thing that isn't just your home, but is like your financial future. There is absolute political strife around affordability, driving things like the Mamdani victory in New York. And even like, the young fans of Nick Fuentes and others who just say like the whole system of the basics of what we need for our lives has been rigged against us. It's become impossible to afford a home. I know some of the folks that work for me who are younger just feel like they're never going to be able to afford to buy a home. They look at where things are at and they say, how is this going to work? How do you understand where we are right now and what might be paths to something healthier if it's unhealthy and broken and corrupt in some way? And I'll just point to two things real quick and then I'll open it up, which is there does seem to be very much a political problem, which is those of us, myself included, that already are on the train and have a home, don't want the value to go down. And so we are in a political interest group that opposes things like building more housing, deregulating zoning, allowing multi-units to come into our neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. To make it more succinct, opposed to a free market.
Yeah, opposed, we don't want to lose tax benefits that accrue to those of us that have mortgage interest, all this stuff geared towards current homeowners. And so we're at political war in a certain sense with first-time home buyers.
Yeah.
And that's a political issue that keeps policies in place that might otherwise change. It kind of reminds me of Uber coming into New York City and like the value of the taxi cab medallion.
Yeah.
And how do you solve that in a world where, hey, like some guy bought a taxi cab medallion for $1 million on the assumptions that the rules would stay the same. And then along comes Uber. And next thing you know, this thing that he put his life on hock for is worth 200 grand. And it's like, on one hand, yes, sucks for you, brother. On another hand, it's like, well, this is really like profoundly the ground shifting below your feet type of stuff. So how do you understand
I think you have to distinguish. You did a little bit of a bait and switch there in the analogy, if I can extract it.
Sure.
Nobody bought a home ever being told, and there will never be more homes bought. Built.
Sure.
There was never a rule. You may have thought you were getting certain tax treatment. You may have thought that there was certain, in California, they have Prop 13, which limits the property tax increase. The mortgage interest was believed to be deductible up to a certain price, and all that's been grandfathered. But nobody believed that they were buying a home and that no other homes could be built. And that's the major issue that is protectionist policy for the political interest group you describe, which is current homeowners that have equity.
Yeah. The taxi cab medallion is an extreme example for sure. But keep going. For the young person here,
protectionism and certain industries and sectors that are looking for government policy to protect them from disruption and competition is as old as, well before Adam Smith. What is unique in American housing is that it isn't a sector, it is about half the population. And what is happening culturally is that the beneficiaries of this cult of housing are dying off and diminishing relative to the Gen Zers and Gen Yers that are coming up. We have more millennials than we do boomers now. And so the numbers are changing, and it's creating a great deal of societal angst. I would like to say that what I diagnosed as a fundamental problem in financial crisis, which was what I referred to as the cult of housing, has gone away. But it obviously hasn't. There are still a lot of people who believe that the fundamental aim of American economic life is to have a big home. And I disagree that equity in one's home is the most important part of one's financial well-being. So everybody has to live somewhere. And so unless you are selling your home, the equity in it is not monetizable per se, but we have this notion of feeling richer and bragging rights and social strata and other elements. All I want is for people to have mobility, dynamism, flexibility, and reasonable affordability, all subject to market conditions. And we don't have that because the fingers are on the scale. I do disagree with policies that try to stimulate demand and activity that I think ultimately create distorted decision-making. So the mortgage interest deduction, I think, is an abomination. But it's actually reasonably small ball in a world of lower interest rates. It was a much bigger deal back when rates were a lot higher. The last couple of years, mortgage interest rates have come up, and it might be a bigger issue now. But because most Americans are still holding a mortgage under 4% in cost, the mortgage interest deduction matters, but it's a much less relevant element than it used to be. But it's the zoning issues you referred to. It's the impediments to building new supply. It is the fact that not only do you have environmental regulations in most blue states and permitting requirements and so forth that become very difficult. And then it's very hard to get capital investment to come out and risk because the entitlement may not come. And it's just too arduous of a process to go about building new housing stock. We also have a ton of housing stock that has to be replaced. So even if you get permits to tear down a home and build a new home, your net new number when you do that is zero. And so we just have tons of work to do here. But who is the biggest opposition to it? Is it liberal mayors? Is it liberal governors? Or is it the 300 Republicans that show up to a city council meeting to complain about new housing getting built? The NIMBYism is a bipartisan atrocity.
Yeah, one of the things that has happened here in Austin is there was reforms passed with support actually from some folks I know, peripherally, to actually make it easier to build, and actually housing prices have come down for a bunch of reasons. It wasn't just that, but I mean, housing stock is increasing. Housing prices in Austin have actually declined. I want to come back to something you were saying about the demographics, because so you said that there are now literally more millennials alive than boomers alive. Is that right?
Yes.
And so what is happening there, and what does it point to for the future of the current available housing? Because one of the things that is weird about the moment we're in is we went through this stretch where interest rates got crazy low, 3% and below for a 30-year fixed rate mortgage.
Right.
I have a sub 4% fixed rate 30-year mortgage myself. I have no interest in moving to get a 7 or 6% mortgage. So I have strong disincentive today,
right,
to put my house up for sale. So that reduces the supply of housing for the new first-time home buyer. But what's this broader demographic thing? What's actually happening there? What does that mean? Break it down for me.
Well, first of all, one of the complexities too, which again is outside the purview of government policy, but is a cultural phenomena, was that the millennials, which are the highest population base across the different generations in adult society, they were getting married later and having kids later and having less kids than their Gen X predecessors and certainly the baby boomer predecessors before that. And so that then distorted things with there was less single family residence housing stock getting built because there was less demand, because generally people's first time single family resident purchase is when they're married and starting to have a kid or two. And if millennials were going to stay single to 35 and then get married at 37 and then just have one kid, the kind of overall demography was changing some of those demand fundamentals. But then now they have gotten older and the amount of available housing stock is not there. And that came in a byproduct of post-financial crisis. We had a glut. We have years and years of foreclosure inventory that had to be worked through. So there was nobody building new houses from 2010 to 2015. And there was no capital investment going into it. So there's all these different factors working together that really created the kind of perfect storm. And if there's any sort of encouraging element in this, it's that when we talk about the housing problem, the what you said about I want to hold my price, right? That's what people who are of a certain age and stage of life, their priority is I want to maintain my equity or grow my equity. And so this permanently escalating housing price, wages aren't going up 10%. The economy is not growing 10%. So why in the world do people think their house should be going up 10% in value? This is very, very, very easy math in a spreadsheet. If the incomes in your community are going up 3% a year, and if your house prices are going up anything more than 3% a year, then people are going to need more of their income to pay for their house in the future, and they're going to have less income available for other things. And we've done that at scale in our country, and we've done it with a birthright expectation from boomers that their house is supposed to go up 10% per year. Well, the math doesn't work if wages aren't growing at the same level. Now, you got away with it for years because mortgage rates went from 10% down to 3%, so that covered up a lot of it. But with some normalized interest rates, and even normalized, they're going to have to stay in a 4 or 5% range. The 6, 7 was intolerable. 2, 3 is, God forbid, never going to come back. So the policymakers want to see a 4 or 5 mortgage environment. But my point is that there is not a way to justify this type of double-digit or even high single-digit housing price growth when wages aren't growing to that degree. And so your question about what this looks like now in the current moment is there are a lot of Gen Zers that are 26, 27. They went to college. They might have got a grad degree. They have a 6-figure income. They're kind of on the right playbook for life. They've done a lot of these things well, and they're not even in the stratosphere of being able to afford a home in the area that they work. The down payment is prohibitive, and then the sticker price of the home and what the monthly mortgage would be is prohibitive. And my argument is that this is almost entirely a byproduct of inadequate supply.
Do you have any causes for hope, or do you see a path to this being resolved? You know, I think about one of the moments in my lifetime, at least, I'm 48, that I think is helpful, is you had a period of time in the aftermath of sort of the riots and the urban disasters of the 60s, 70s, 80s, where even like liberal Democrats felt it was politically viable to be tough on crime. Like we have these senses these days, like everything's year zero, and the other side will never come around because they're evil and stupid. But we've had these political reversals where things that seemed like dogma suddenly became not dogma anymore. On the housing and affordability front, like, do you see any signs that there's something good? It's not Mamdani, because he literally wants to keep all the worst things and then just spray taxpayer money on it, and bark at landlords not to raise their price. But what would be structural that could change that's viable?
Two things. I do see a couple glimmers of hope, but there's plenty of other pessimistic things too that we haven't even got into. Primarily, that some of the policy solutions coming from the right are worse than ever. And I usually want to look to the right as being the voice of reason and a counter voice to the bad ideas from the left. And I simply don't see that right now. But here's the two areas I'd be optimistic in. I've spent most of my adult life listening to older people say, God forbid anything ever happen that lowers my price of home, my value of home. And now many of those people have adult children that can't afford to buy a home anywhere near their neighborhood. And now all of a sudden they're saying, okay, this isn't working.
Oh, that's
so
interesting.
Because it's now hit their own family tree, there's a little bit of a broadening of the impact. And the lines are a little less clear as to who is on one side of the political interest group and who's on the other, because mom and dad want their Gen Z and Gen Y kids to be able to afford a home, and they're beneficiaries of a system that has kept that from happening.
I mean, one mechanism
might get resolved.
One mechanism there at the family level is like, hey, if you have equity, maybe take out an equity loan and give it to your kid for a down payment.
And plenty are doing that. Now, obviously, not everyone has the means to do that, but plenty are doing it. But I think there are specifics that could get into resolution, I think even at a higher level, though, I just think it's good to have that tension because it breaks the impasse over time. But then the second element is that NIMBYism or a critique of it has become more bipartisan. You know, there's still private property rights advocates like myself on the right, and there's always been some degree of people out of the supply side movement that I've dedicated much of my life to that recognize production of goods and services is how you grow your way out of economic issues, and that the solution for high prices is more supply. And these are pretty fundamental pedestrian ideas that we get away from with things like housing or healthcare or whatnot. And so there is now guys like Ezra Klein or Derek Thompson, other center-left writers and thinkers, where I don't think this is becoming a movement on the left, but Matthew Yglesias is another example. There's some voices of reason on the left that are coming around to this same message at one shape or another.
Yeah. They're all called neoliberal shills by the internet left-wingers, though. So there's that.
Yeah.
And that sort of maybe brings me
But
to...
I don't know, don't you, from an Overton window standpoint, don't you think we need more neoliberal shills than Mamdani's?
I would I stand by a kind of Gen X nostalgia, which says that the late 90s and early 2000s was the peak of Western civilization, or at least Western cultural civilization. Although that makes me like an old head.
Yeah.
And I can and I'm reminded of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, where in the back half of it, he's talking about the psychology of the search for happiness and being, pursuing purpose and service as the bank shot to happiness. But one of the things that book talks about in the 1950s is he talks about the young up-and-coming generation being lazy, spoiled, nihilistic, and doomed to destroy the society. And it's like, well, I guess some of this is perennial. Some of this is a perennial, like, oh, those kids going crazy stuff. Yeah. We have all of this points to this idea of populism to me, that we are in a populist political moment in America. The Trump presidency very much is a populist presidency.
Oh yeah.
Europe is more sclerotic, but they have their populist movements. The Davos types can kind of run the table in Europe a lot easier than they can here in the U.S. But there seems like there are these tensions. How do you understand, like, the populist moment? What is it from your perspective? Because the kind of like the old like free market Reaganite mindset is not in cultural ascent right now. It is it is like a remnant in the wilderness being like, hey, what about freedom and free markets? And what about not bullying other people with the law to get what you want? Like, what about that?
Yeah, well, I believe, and this is not the view a lot of my anti-populist friends on the right have, but I believe that populism is just simply the other side of a coin from statism. That what they both have in common is a lack of vision for individuals that are rooted to the appropriate moral formation, institutions, bedrocks of civilization, family, community, etc. And so populism always and forever leads to statism. And so this view of these institutions have failed us, the elites have failed us. You could argue that the one side of this, and I guess what I'm getting to is a sort of classic horseshoe theory of the case. But you could argue, well, you have these Davos types, they're the worst. They've done all this bad stuff, and so we want to be anti-statist. But then it seems to me that the anti-elitism, anti-Davos camp that you're describing as populism, that it is not proposing an alternative that is rooted in strong individual responsibility and the necessary, what Yuval Levin refers to as mediating institutions in society. So a severe, autonomous, hyper-libertarian vision of society that is ruggedly individualistic but untethered to community and morality, I think has as good a chance of succeeding as the elites at Davos do. where the Reaganite vision, the Burkean vision, the Tocquevillian vision, the American experiment, I think, is essentially one of individual responsibility, but in a bedrock of institutions like family and church with a very limited view of state. Populism narrowly asks for a high view of state to come implement by coercion what is popular. And the only difference is its motivation. Elitism says we need big state because these are our best and most powerful. These are our best and brightest. These are the central planners. These are the technocrats that have the right spreadsheets. And so we can all agree to discount that absurdity. But all the populists are basically saying is the elites are terrible, and therefore what we need is the state to come punish them. And it replaces the state. It replaces the elites with new elites. They may dress differently and talk differently, have gone to different universities, but the point is it's still both a power religion. They're both power religions.
I've been revisiting this to try to understand it more because it's I don't. These are words that that get thrown around, populism, in our discourse, and and I feel the pull of that populist anger towards the elite. Let's say I have a populist element to myself. I call it my Jersey Philly core. It's I was born in Philly, although I really grew up in the outskirts. But there is a level of it's the luxury beliefs crowd. It's the sense of I read this book of Charles Murray's Coming Apart.
Absolutely.
And so you have a cohort of people. I think that there's almost a Marxist flavor to this of class warfare. But you have a group of people who come together, they go to the same schools, they end up having very similar sensibilities. They're the ones that, not that long ago, they would be the ones that watched Mad Men, which almost nobody watched unless you were in this set, and then it was this show that you loved, but no one really, it was never a popular show, but it was like a elite show, like HBO.
Yeah.
The HBO watchers. And then you get these information jobs, finance, media, journalism, academia, and tech to some extent. Tech's a little more weird. It's got other weird stuff going on, and the worldview is in conflict with the rest of the society, or it's detached from it. And so one way I've heard this described is that you have a group of people that are the everywheres, that can belong anywhere, I'm a global citizen, versus the somewheres. It's like, well, no, I live in this place and I grew up here, or even if I moved, I still have a certain amount of rootedness. And the everywheres and the somewheres are now occupying two different tracks that are at odds with each other. How do you think about that? How do you think about those cultural tensions in right now?
Well, that's a great question. I want to first say, from your analogy with Coming Apart, that Charles does more than just that, though, right?
Yeah.
He's pointing out the way that the elites are able to live and have their enclave of better education, certain comforts and amenities and jobs. And a lot of times they kind of removal from concern for others. But then what is his diagnosis as to how Fishtown in the book came to be versus Belmont? That white America largely adopted many of the habits that they used to condemn.
Oh, yeah. Breakdown in marriage.
Getting girls pregnant and not marrying them. Higher divorce rates, higher teen pregnancy, higher high school dropout, higher prison recidivism. All of these negative issues. Murray's Coming Apart book was transformatively important to me in understanding this as a cultural malady, not a political malady.
Well, and I think when I said luxury beliefs, that's sort of the modern version of it's the I'm a young feminist. I'm going to Yale. I talk about their marriage being an oppressive patriarchy. But then when you ask me, well, do you want to get married? I say, oh, of course. And then fast forward 5 years and I'm married with kids, living in the suburbs, going to church. And I'm
Oh, it's
basically
funny you say it prophetically. I think it's far worse than that. I think generally they already are married. They're already married, already have kids, already doing all the things that make for happy life while refusing to say to others, this is the recipe for a good life. And that's where Charles Lyon, I love so much that I've stolen from him many times, is that the people you're referring to just refuse to preach what they practice.
Yes. Yeah. And he lays that out really. It's like the divorce rates among the sort of the elites living in super zip codes like Austin or northern New Jersey enclaves and whatnot, Manhattan, Washington, D.C., the collar counties of Philly, etc. They're living fundamentally conservative lives and then preaching a kind of woke, degenerate dogma that they know would be horrible for them and is horrible for everybody, but they social signal or something.
Yep,
But
exactly.
that stuff, the coming apart part has shifted to where we are now. Like it feels more apart, and I can't tell how much of that's the internet and social media versus reality. But
yeah, I think that there's so much sociologically in the book that is going to allows people like us to analyze it, think about it, unpack it. I wonder a lot what happened that CEOs used to go to restaurants and eat lunch with some of their middle managers and line workers, and now their paths just simply never cross. I mean, there are social elements that I hope have social resolution. A lot of it as a man of faith is I don't believe in churches that all the rich people go to one church, all the poor people go to another church. I want a diversity, to use that buzzword, that is socioeconomic in places like our houses of worship. And the coming apart that we're referring to here is more than an economic and political story. It's fundamentally a cultural story that I think has a lot of causes. And I think a lot of it does come down to the various life decisions people make. And you really need to see more judgmentalism, which is something that Charles talks about too. I think you have to have people. I talked earlier about the folks that would go to the bar on Friday night and brag about how they gave back the bank 4 keys to houses. They should not have the girls be impressed with them. They should have the girls say, "Oh my gosh, you're a loser." You know what I mean? That like there should be some nobility in achievement and not in milking the system and so forth. But even if you get down to what I think is your primary area of concern right now, which is how the populist moment is going to encounter with public policy, which is kind of the heart of a lot of the Trumpist reality, is the way we're talking about free trade, the way we're talking about, even just sort of general economic policy that we think the federal government in particular has a really, really special hand to play in creating greater equality, in creating greater popular tickles. That to me is the experiment we're in the middle of playing out that is going to end very, very badly. And I am hard pressed to find an example in history where it at the other side of the failure of the populist experiment, it led to greater freedom. It almost always leads to greater state control.
there's this Trump and the politics on the right now are interesting for this reason, because I feel like I sort of personally stand in two worlds here. In that, you and I have a lot of friends that are in this sort of more classical, conservative economic policy wonkery land. And I find myself not disagreeing, because I believe fundamentally in just individual free enterprise and all the same things, more or less. But the log jams in our society, like the inability, like we don't pass legislation very much anymore. Like where are the laws getting passed here to do things? There's something like, I do wonder a little bit if like government has gotten so big and so complex that it can't unwind the things that need to be unwound. It's always adding another roll of wallpaper on top of prior poorly installed ripply wallpaper, and then being like, why can't I get the ripple out of this wall? It's like, well, because there's 5 layers of rippled wallpaper, and the bottom layer has a ripple in it. And
Yeah.
and I think that like the positive thing, the thing I've always kind of liked about Trump, even though I think it's dangerous, is he is a guy that's more willing to be like, why don't we rip this down to the studs and put up, and it's like, will he put up fresh sheetrock? Will he just leave it bare and then run off with his Trump coin? I don't know, but adding like the marginalism of the conservative movement, I think, I don't know. How do you think about that? Does it work? Are we like at an impasse here?
Well, there's a lot in there. First of all, part of it is complicated by, I think, how much overthinking people do of what's driving Trump. And when people are trying to view him as a historical figure and what role he's going to play in it, a lot of times I think they miss that, he's, I think there's a little bit more narcissism driving things than ideology.
Yeah, I think it's all narcissism, actually.
We're trying to pack competing ideologies into his pathology that don't necessarily fit. But nevertheless, you're right that there is a question as to what is the best way to go about dealing with the predicament we find ourselves in. And many people are fond right now of saying conservatives are doing armchair wonkishness, and maybe the thing has just gotten so bad we're stuck with certain things. And my own belief that is actually stemming from very, very strong conviction is something called incrementalism, that I do not think that the government got this big quickly. And I do not think it got this complicated quickly.
No.
And so I believe that the unwinding of what we're describing is a mirror image, that it took 30, 40, 50, 70 years for certain things, and it will take that long to get out. And that the only 2 things that can go wrong are not trying to unwind it, which I will work like heaven and hell to make happen, but then trying to unwind it all overnight with a bomb going off, because that will fail, and then people will be begging for more statism. And so I think that there has to be technique, not just piety. And unfortunately, right now, populism is marinating itself in piety and good intention and good rhetoric. And we're going to stand up to Davos, and we're finally telling the elites to go home, and we hate private equity and blah, blah, blah. And none of it's going to work. None of it's going to go anywhere. None of it really even gets past a couple thousand points of a drop in the Dow before we start selling more NVIDIA chips to China than ever. So none of it's really serious. But if you ask me if I'm optimistic that there is a play, even if it's not the play anyone's running right now, is there a play for this? There is. It's an incremental unwinding of the Wilsonian experiment.
I don't know how I feel about that. There's a part of me that believes it's certainly the prudent small c conservative path, because most revolutions end in mass murder and beheadings, right? Like the American Revolution is like so weird in that we were extracting ourselves from a distant power over an ocean and fundamentally wanted to just keep doing what we were doing here. And that's unlike, say, the French Revolution that was like, oh, off with their heads, and now let's turn Notre Dame into the Tower of Reason, and then Robespierre immediately begins a reign of terror. And that's the way most of this stuff tends to go when it's domestic reform oriented, right?
Yeah.
So I totally get the worry that the downside risk is almost seems like 100%. I guess my question would be on the increments in the other direction is that the way the ratchet effect works? Or is it not symmetrical in that way? Like, is it that you basically have the natural, like Thomas Jefferson, the quote is like, what is it? The tree of liberty needs to be replenished with the blood of tyrants from time to time. But I think, like, when I think about a company and company cultures and the kinds of things that can start to go wrong slowly over time, especially in a company like, say, Microsoft, that's maybe growing and then getting too big for its bridges and getting lazy, it seems like the slow incremental change isn't how these kinds of things turn around. It's usually something like a paradigm shift, like along comes Apple's iPhone, or a massive recession that like you barely survive and like the tide goes out and you see who's got shorts on. But it's like slow crash. You either die or you survive as a new thing and you get reborn. And it's sort of like the way bankruptcy works. So
I agree with you, but I think you're confusing categories, because my comment about incrementalism was specifically in the context of unwinding government. When you talk about societal shifts or technological disruptions, there are frequent periods, where things can happen very quickly and often out of disruption. But I think that is a different category than the unwinding of government. And even unwinding of government, you could come in and do a welfare reform bill that is very dramatic. But how did a dramatic welfare reform bill come to be without incremental preparation? You have to persuade people. You have to get people elected. You have to make the argument. I'm just totally married to the idea that first you win the argument, then you win the election. And I think that the problem with things that happen very quickly is that they can unhappen very quickly as well.
Yeah.
And when things are properly cooked and prepared and rooted foundationally, they just tend to take hold a lot better. And that's certainly been a major difference in history between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. But I think that how you unwind decades of New Deal government growth versus how a new technology comes that disintermediates the VCR. You see what I'm saying? I think there's a little bit of apples and oranges there. Yeah.
I think I take your point. I think what do you think is that getting harder in America? It seems like it is. It seems like there's forces that are making the kind of like cumulative arguments towards something that's actually constructive and realistic and not just rhetoric harder. Like the last time I feel like there was an actual like debate that was very widespread, that everybody was not everybody, but like that a lot of people were talking about was the passage of Obamacare.
Yeah.
Which was not good. Like Obamacare sucked.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's totally a failure. Its assumptions are bad. Mm-hmm. Its premises were terrible. But there was like all kinds of debate about this thing. And then legislation got passed. And I don't know if there's been another thing like that since. And maybe I'm misremembering. Maybe I'm missing some big one but it seems like it's getting harder. It's like we're becoming a more childish, reactionary society at kind of every scale. Do you agree with that, or do you think I'm overly dramatic?
Reactionary, childish, but I would argue actually one of the failures of the right to resist Obamacare was even in that debate, our debate argument was what we were against and not what we were for. the inability of the Trump 1.0 administration to repeal Obamacare. I laugh when people say it was because John McCain voted no with the thumbs down. What he voted no on was in no way, shape, or form going to repeal Obamacare. The Republicans have been afraid of debate about what their positive affirmative view in terms of national health care policy ought to be. I think you're right. The Democrats came out with an argument, and you notice they had an intramural debate too, because they wanted a public policy option.
Yeah.
And they couldn't get it through politically, but there was a debate on their side as to whether or not that needed to be there, and were they willing to incrementally advance the cause of governmental subsidies in healthcare, even without what their ultimate end run is, or at least for a lot of them, which is single payer. And so the debate has to precede the outcome. What the Republicans, or I should say the right, has largely been content to do is have debate only by basis of opposition, which is reactionary. We're against free trade. Well, what does that mean? We're against globalism. What are we exactly talking about? It's not intellectually rigorous. And in fact, it's a feature, not a bug, to be anti-intellectual these days. That's part of populism. Once you start saying, let's get a bunch of people together to discuss this and think through it and argue and write white papers and do a symposium, then you're just one of these Davos, post-war sellouts. So we're not in a healthy place to have a lot of these debates. Monetary policy, it's impossible to have a grown-up constructive conversation about. Perhaps foreign policy is an area where there's been a little bit of debate within the right in a post-Iraq context, as far as, where the lines are supposed to be drawn. A lot of people willing to avoid a radical isolationism, nobody wanting to go to a radical interventionism. So there's some willingness to kind of debate where America's role in the world is supposed to be. I don't think it's a debate that has been settled by any means, but you hear some discussions on that subject. But no, right now, the extent of debate about economic policy is largely limited to Twitter sound bites that are populist in their orientation, and that is from the right and the left.
I mean, I think, we live in a world where it's so hard to know what's broadly believed because, for example, I will routinely do these 1-hour videos on Fridays that get incredibly wonky. And I'm always surprised some of the wonkiest ones actually do the best, and the comments are awesome. And it gives me this hope that there's a lot of demand and a lot of hunger to engage in the actual substance of issues. I feel like the podcast movement points towards something like a hunger for more depth in the public in general. But it's just one of the many weird things of our moment that we're simultaneously listening to 3-hour conversations about wonky subjects in biohacking or Peter Zahan talking about geopolitics, but then we look to Washington and there's no substantive debate about what should monetary policy actually look like moving forward? Hey, did you notice that we're still not down to 2% inflation? Shouldn't we be down to that by now? What the hell's going on? Should it even be 2% or should it be 0? Should it actually be negative? Should prices go down with productivity growth? You got to dust off George Selgin books from the 90s to have that kind of thing happen. And who the hell's doing that? Nerds.
Yeah.
At the biggest level, as we kind of, start to get towards the end of our time together, I know your time's limited. You and I both, I see the world through a Christian lens, ethically. I'm Catholic. I know your dad, if I understand it, was actually am I getting this right, was a Calvinist preacher, an apologist?
He was.
How do you think about the tension or the feedback between Christianity as a worldview, as an operating system, and liberalism? And I don't mean liberalism in the American left sense. I mean liberalism as the broader set of ideas that are rooted in the Constitution, or John Locke, John Stuart Mill.
Well, you're poisoning the well, because I dispute the notion that liberalism is rooted to John Locke and John Stuart Mill, though I most certainly understand historically where some of the secular Enlightenment liberalism has heritage in Locke, and there's plenty we can borrow from. But my belief that liberalism, or classical liberalism, properly defined, is inescapably rooted to the scripture. That the dignity of the human person and the concept of natural rights, foremost among them the right of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and that these are rights secured by the government but not created by the government. They're created by our Creator. The things that stem out of that, like freedom of assembly and freedom of speech and freedom of expression and so forth, these things are all part of our liberal tradition, that it's at the basis of the American experiment, but these things are all necessarily, in terms of their moral foundation, rooted to the Judeo-Christian worldview. So I do not see liberalism as at odds with Christianity. I see liberalism as scaffolding that allows those of us of a Christian worldview to not get killed for having our beliefs. And it allows us to coexist with people of different beliefs, but it is not something that I advocate for out of feigned worldview neutrality. That is the liberalism I oppose, which is the belief that up can be down and down can be up at the same time. Or a liberalism that becomes intellectually incoherent, that is somehow saying the jihadis and the LGBT community can coexist, when actually one of them says that they're going to throw the other one off of a building. So I believe in a moral absolutes and a liberalism that facilitates these things in a structurally pluralistic society. And I believe these things because I am a Christian, not despite the fact that I'm a Christian.
You and I see this in exactly the same way. I am coming to this in my middle age with more of a sense of it than 10 years ago. I'm sort of coming back to my Catholicism. I talk about it on the show from time to time. And a book by Tom Holland called Dominion has proven to be incredibly important to me. I'd put it in my sort of top 10 most influential books I've ever read. And he makes this case, right, that the sort of everything we call Western civilization, everything we look at as sort of embodied in the Bill of Rights, this notion of universal human equality in some metaphysical sense, is an outgrowth of Christian moral ethics. And I think the question that's come to haunt me is, and challenge some of my own views on things, is liberalism without Christianity doesn't seem like it stays very particularly liberal, particularly long. The sort of denatured, liberalism as just a set of assertions that come from nowhere because they work or something. Like, oh, well, we're all equal just because we're human. Well, that's like a tautology. What are you saying?
We provide the metaphysics.
Well, can anything like the American conception of freedom and individual liberty and sovereignty of the person survive a post-Christian age?
No. So then the question is, how do you salvage the Christian age? And where some that are in this particular moment impatient or frustrated or populist in tactic, or in some cases just simply, provocative, what they want to default to is coercion. And my view is that your premises are correct, and that I take that so seriously that it intensifies the need for the things that generate the real, not the transitory, the substantive transformation by which the Christian roots are necessary that will preserve a lasting and classical liberalism. The liberal society will not survive without Christian roots. Where do the Christian roots come from? Not by coercion or state imposition, but by evangelism, education, the strong families and communities. That there is a bottom-up work to be done that a lot of people don't want to do. And why should they have to do it? The left says we can command control our way to our agenda. State imposition can get things done. And the right is now saying, you know what, the left has it easy. We got to do the same thing. And I'm sorry, but I categorically reject that impatience.
I think you can sort of see this in the evolution of Charlie Kirk's efforts over time. He became increasingly, and I'm sort of a latecomer from his assassination to his efforts and his videos, like a lot of people, because I wasn't really his target audience. Yeah. But I know his book just came out about, the Sabbath, and like immediately sold out on Amazon. It seems like he reached this too, the extent to which he was actually like a highly effective Christian apologist was sort of escaped me. I didn't realize that. I didn't realize how good he was at that, actually.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot of people in the sort of free market right. I think this is an interesting sort of thing where there's a bunch of overlapping diagrams. There's a lot of people like you and I who are both faith-oriented and believe in free enterprise and believe in material progress, so long as you don't turn the guns you invent on yourself. But there's clear tensions there. So do you reject the notion that there's a sort of self-destruction baked into the liberalism, that Christianity gives birth to a liberal order, an order of tolerance of difference and democracy, let's say, and that then degenerates into a bunch of scumbaggery and parasitism and then like anything goes and down with the family and feminist whack job stuff. And then the guns get turned on the underlying Christianity, and then you have neither Christianity nor liberalism after the fact. Is that there's a cycle?
Yeah, you are correct. I categorically reject that setup. I categorically reject the notion of it being inerrant.
Why?
Well, I believe that what we're referring to is a wrong diagnosis of causation, that where the family degrades, where we attempt an intellectually schizophrenic multiculturalism, where we attempt a moral relativism, those things break down. Christianity, allowed to flourish with freedom in society, does not inherently do any of those things. In fact, it now provides the ecosystem by which we can have schools and mediating institutions that do moral formation, that speak to real doctrines of marriage and sanctity of life and sexual morality, and allow for strong communities and ecclesiastical formation and whatnot. All of these other things that we're describing that are byproducts of the sexual revolution or the Great Society or moral relativism, they didn't come about because of freedom. They came about because of the good guys not doing their job. Feminism wasn't a natural byproduct. Radical feminism was not a natural byproduct of liberty. It was a natural byproduct of secular autonomy. So we have a bigger burden than just defending the liberal society. In other words, I believe in a family sitting down for dinner together. But I don't believe that just because they do that, the food is going to taste good. So I don't want to take away our ability to sit down together. But once we sit down together, let's also prepare a nice meal. Let's have it well seasoned. Let's have good conversation. Let's clear the table. Let's have dessert. It's just, this is what's happened, is people said, well, because we sat down for dinner, that's why all these things went wrong. No, it isn't. We didn't do the other things we needed to do. We granted the myth of neutrality. Liberalism does not mean all points of view are equally valid. They can legally coexist, but there is not neutrality about truth claims. That's where we lose this battle. So I believe in vigorously defending the truth claims of our belief system. And back to as we wrap up now, back to the very first thing we talked about to begin with. This is why I believe the financial crisis springboarded into a place of tremendous economic vulnerability about what we believe our vision for economic life and society is. Because we did not defend, the 20th century free market advocates did it out of secular rationalism. They did not do it rooted to a distinctly Christian epistemology.
The man, do I agree with that? Absolutely, like profoundly. That's good. Your framing's going to this is going to live with me for a while, because just to process. Because one of the things that it points to is an argument internally among people who sort of see themselves sort of on the right, let's say, although not narrowly. This right, left stuff is all kind of this interesting, weird, historical. It's like, why is it on the right? It's because of the French Revolution and the assembly and the aristocrats being on one side. But I think that it does beg the question internally. We're in a moment of a lot of internal battles. Oh, we've got the Nick Fuentes kind of like Joker characters on one side who are making interesting points, but then are also like really self-proclaimed collectivists about race and about other stuff. And then you've got other parts of our friend group, let's say, who are super rationalists and atheists and think like, no, like Richard Dawkins is right. And no, all this stuff you claim came out of Christianity. It actually really didn't. It came out of the Enlightenment types, and you're projecting and you're drawing lines that aren't there. What I'm hearing you say is that we have to make a case to our friends to get on board with a combined argument, this argument, that we need to basically argue for the good, the true, and the beautiful.
Absolutely. And that an inability to do that will undermine the rest. So those that want to go argue for liberty without virtue will lose the liberty argument, and those who want to argue for virtue without liberty will lose the virtue argument. That it is the juxtaposition of these things that is, first of all, distinctly Christian, but second of all, necessary for the agenda that we're talking about. That you will not have one without the other.
I know our time has come to an end. I ask this of every guest on the first time on the show. The show's called Dad Saves America, very much in that spirit, that I believe that as a man, and I know you are a father as well, that being a dad, embracing it as a central part of your identity and your purpose in life is one of the best things you can do, obviously for your family and for your kids, but also for the community and then ultimately for the country. And if every man sort of saw being a father as being one of the highest callings, we would have a lot of healing in this country in a generation. Both in terms of being a father, but also in all of your work and efforts, how do you see your role in the American story?
Well, I think that there are multiple hats that God has seen fit to allow me to wear. And one of my favorite hats is that of a father. My oldest son is getting ready to turn 21. My daughter is 18, a senior in high school, and my baby boy is now a freshman in high school. So they're at, slightly different stages of life, but being a father represents not only all the opportunity to pour into them and their own well-being and what they are going to do and who they're going to be in their lives, but it also is just this soul-filling endeavor that is a source of tremendous joy for me personally. And at the same time, I do believe that I have a tremendous responsibility as a businessman and as a writer, as a thinker in my own community, what I do with my capital. There are various venues which my belief system needs to play out. The thing I've had to learn to do, I'm a little bit older than you, but we're both Gen Xers. But as a 51-year-old man who's been, successful professionally, I wrestle with time allocation and getting to a point where I feel the wisdom of saying yes to some things and no to others. There's a few things we've discussed today that are the things that most animate me in the world. There's hundreds of things we didn't discuss today that I'm on board with and that I believe in, but I just can't do all things. The need is not always the call. There's a lot of needs. I'm called to a few less things. Well, being a father is a non-negotiable. Being a husband is a non-negotiable. Being involved in my church is non-negotiable. I started a Christian high school. I teach economics at it in Southern California. That's a non-negotiable for me. But when you look at these different things we've spoken about today and all the stuff that we both care about or passionate about, the one that I think I'm most uniquely called to, have giftedness in, and have this tremendous burden for that I don't think 100,000 other people are also doing, is making this case for a free society, for a market economy, for free enterprise, rooted to transcendent truth, rooted to a moral framework. That's the issue that I feel most called to. And it exists simultaneously with my work as a father.
David Bahnsen, thanks for being on Dad Saves America. I'm glad I could keep us in a conversation that touched on the stuff you cared about most. That was it's good to hear, and I definitely want to have you back real soon.
Thanks so much. Really enjoyed it.